Hello, my name is Sarah Morgan. I'm a sophomore at Missouri State University, majoring in English literature and double minoring in linguistics and Asian studies. I wrote the following paper for my critical approaches to literature class. It is titled Disappearance and Loss: The Erasure of Native Americans in Willa Cather's My Ántonia. The oppression of Native Americans by white settlers is part of the dark American history of imperialism and westward expansion. Although many literary critics have applauded Willa Cather for her historically accurate portrayal of immigrant life in Nebraska, she leaves out a vital part of the history of the Plains by virtually discluding Native Americans in My Ántonia. By describing the presence of Native Americans as ancient history, and by glorifying the untouched prairies, Cather's erasure of Native Americans reflects the ignorance of white settlers towards Native culture and belittles the struggles of natives brought upon by white imperialism. In this essay, I have 4 main points. Number 1, we'll cover how Cather references Native Americans in a way that suggests that they weren't present in the West when settlers arrived, and were instead a thing of the far past, which creates an idealized version of the Plains. Number 2, we'll cover how white settlers during the time of My Ántonia were unfamiliar with and distanced themselves from the cultures of Native Americans. Number 3, we'll briefly cover the inhumane treatment of Native Americans by the United States government and how Cather's omission of natives contributes to this history of brutality. The 4th and final point will cover how Jim Burden works for the railway system, yet does not acknowledge that the railroads were built on stolen native lands, resulting in Jim becoming an unreliable narrator in a story where he recalls the struggles of settling the West. As a Nebraskan, Cather's love of the state shines through in her depictions of the landscape. When Jim Burden first arrives in Nebraska as a young boy, he describes the territory as, quote, nothing but land. Not a country at all, but the material out of which countries are made, end quote. This romanticization of the land reflects how settlers and immigrants viewed the West as an uncharted territory just waiting to be settled. However, this was not untouched land. Native Plains Indians once inhabited the land before the arrival of Jim and the Shimerdas, and many settlers before them. Michael Gorman writes that Jim's view of Nebraska solidifies, quote, the pioneer myth of the American West that has been cultivated in a soil broken and furrowed by the colonizing impulse of empire, end quote. Jim views the land as ripe with raw materials, the materials needed to build a great nation. Great nations of Native Americans had already existed here, however. Cather writes as if the prairies have been devoid of humans until the arrival of the settlers, which is completely untrue. She erases the impact Native Americans had on the land she knows and loves. Native Americans are rarely mentioned at all in My Ántonia, which itself is an obvious exclusion. When they are referenced, they are treated as if they are a thing of the past and no longer relevant to the world Jim lives in. As a young boy, Jim remembers seeing traces of Native Indian life. Quote, beyond the pond, on the slope that climbed to the cornfield, there was, faintly marked in the grass, a great circle where the Indians used to ride. Jake and Otto were sure that when they galloped round that ring, the Indians tortured prisoners, bound to a stake in the center. But grandfather thought they merely ran races or trained horses there, end quote. Many settlers, such as Jake and Otto, were quite unfamiliar with Native Indian lifestyles and cultures. They assumed that the natives were barbaric and violent, uncivilized and savage, like ancient tribes from long ago. However, to some extent, it was not the fault of the immigrant settlers that they were not educated on the livelihoods of local Native American tribes. Mike Fisher states that although Nebraskans were familiar with the existence of Native Americans, such as the Sioux, Nebraskan newspapers painted natives as, quote, warring tribes with dirty habits, end quote, and were, quote, far more concerned with the price and yield of land than they were with drawing sensitive or accurate portraits of those peoples being thrown off of the land, end quote. It was not the United States government's priority to educate settlers about the complex cultures of the Native Americans they would encounter out west. It was much easier to claim that all natives are savages and use this to justify taking native lands. As a result, settlers knew only what they had been told about Native Americans, which formed the false, widespread notion that natives were uncultured and backwards. Cather's references to Native Americans are distant. She creates an idyllic version of the American West as white Americans saw it. This history, however, is vastly different from the one Native Americans remember. According to Kelly Wisecup, texts like My Ántonia, quote, established long-standing literary and historical narratives. Their descriptions of dying or absent people offer one origin for Euro and U.S. Americans' obsession with describing Native disappearance and loss, end quote. There is a contradictory tendency of colonizers to grieve the loss of the colonized cultures, even though it was their fault that the cultures began to disappear initially. White Americans' views towards Native cultures is no exception. When Jim briefly reminisces on the past of Native Americans in Nebraska, it is with a kind of respect or longing for the days of old. After killing the great rattlesnake and noticing it has 12 rattles, Jim, quote, explained to Ántonia how this meant he, the snake, was 24 years old, that he must have been there when white men first came, left on from Buffalo in Indian times, end quote. Jim is aware of the past existence of Native Americans and buffalo in Nebraska, yet he does not seem bothered by their present absence. He speaks of the Native people and the buffalo, an important part of the lives on the plains, as if they have been gone for hundreds or thousands of years. Yet he mentions how the snake is only 24 years old, and therefore must have been around when the Native Americans occupied the land. Even as a child, Jim knows how recently settlers began to move into the Western territories. However, his acknowledgement of both the disappearance of once populous Native tribes and their replacement by white settlers holds discrepancies. He does not seem to connect the two together and attribute the loss of Native Americans to their removal by the American government to clear land for white settlers. Jim's glorification of the history of the settlers and ignorance of the removal of American Indians reflects the ideas held by many other settlers at the time. The United States government has committed countless atrocities against Native American peoples since its founding. In the 1880s, however, many of these acts were either concealed by the government or made out to be of little importance. The government of the time attempted to justify its actions against Native Americans in the interest of the country's progress. White Americans as a whole did not much care for the natives, so they made no attempt to stop harmful government policies. The removal of Native Americans from their own lands began long before the 1880s, when Jim was a boy. Bettina Drew writes that prior to the Trail of Tears, quote, the smaller Chickasaws and Choctaws, plagued by white intrusion no one would police, ceded land in the 1810s, as Andrew Jackson, a U.S. treaty commissioner, worked to create islands of Indian settlement in a sea of whites, end quote. The prosperous and self-sustaining Native peoples were seen as an obstacle to expansion and were thus moved farther west. As white settlers continued to move west, the government continued to displace natives without concern for their best interests. Land was a commodity, and natives were evidently in the way of American progress and imperialism. For Native Americans, life under United States rule has not been easy. Drew points out that one Cherokee elder in the 1830s likened signing a treaty of cession to signing a death warrant. Because of the long and brutal history of white Americans' oppression of Native Americans, the lack of Native American representation in My Ántonia is a glaring omission. Throughout My Ántonia, Jim Burden describes his love of Nebraska, reflecting Cather's own appreciation. As an adult, Jim, quote, is legal counsel for one of the great Western railways, end quote, and travels west often to the land he loved as a boy, despite living in New York. The unnamed narrator in the introduction claims that Jim, quote, loves with a personal passion the great country through which his railway runs and breaches. His faith in it and his knowledge of it have played an important part in its development, end quote. The Transcontinental Railroad played a vital role in westward expansion. For many white settlers, it symbolized great American progress. However, many of the lands on which the railroad was built were taken from Native Americans. Mike Fisher writes that, quote, as someone who has engineered a cleaned-up version of Nebraska's past, Jim quite fittingly works for the industry that epitomized and engineered American progress, while rarely calculating the cost of that progress to America's indigenous peoples, end quote. It makes sense that Jim works for the railroads because of his love for the West, particularly Nebraska, because the railroad contributed to its growth. However, Jim's railway career reestablishes that he has an idealized view of the West. He picks and chooses the history that benefits him and ignores the rest, therefore creating a glorified past. Michael Gorman builds upon this notion, claiming that, quote, Cather complicates Jim's perspective through its association to the controversial role the railroad played in Indian and white relations, Western settlement patterns, and resource exploitation, end quote. Jim is supposed to give readers a glimpse into the past of the struggles of settling the West, but he becomes an unreliable narrator when he is associated with the railroad and fails to acknowledge the harm it caused Native Americans. Jim rarely mentions Native Americans in My Ántonia as if they were an unimportant blip in American history. The history of Native Americans should not be ignored, and the United States government should not be able to justify the atrocities committed against natives. Native cultures deserve to be preserved and their history kept alive. Erasing Native history is damaging, not only to the peoples whose history is disappearing, but also because ignoring a history of abuse rationalizes the harmful acts committed by the American government and white settlers, as well as belittles Native struggles. By omitting Native Americans from My Ántonia, Willa Cather creates an idealistic version of the American past that contributes to the erasure of Native American history. Native Americans are complex peoples with a multitude of cultures. Their stolen lands were not untouched or ripe for white settlers to take. Native Americans were greatly harmed by westward expansion and American imperialism, and continue to be harmed by unrealistic notions of the West, such as those in My Ántonia. Thank you.